hello to folks that have just joined. We're going to start in a few minutes. We're just going to give a couple more minutes for people to join. But in the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are, what you're looking for from today, and we'll try and make sure we do those things for you. And yeah, just about 2 minutes and then we'll get started. Yeah, for anybody who's just come through, we're going to start in a minute or so. Feel free to introduce yourself and say what you're keen to get out of today in the chat, and we'll try and make sure we do that for you. I'm going to make a start at 11:04. Oh, great. Thanks, Caroline. I will definitely try and do that for you. Okay, folks, we'll make a start now. Anybody who comes in late, it's not the end of the world because I'm going to do a bit of an introduction first. First of all, thank you for joining. Time is precious, so I appreciate yours. Welcome to this Herd Consulting session as part of Leeds Digital Festival. Just to let you know, we're recording the session today so we can share it with folks afterwards. If you don't want to be included in the video, that's totally fine. Please just remove your camera and you'll be left off. Okay. So I'm Scott, and that is a photo of the sticker on the back of my laptop. I'm a product person by trade, and for a couple of decades now, I've been convinced that if something starts well, it tends to end well. I've seen that the amount of effort we put into testing and shaping an idea up front normally equals the amount of success we see with that idea at the end. When I started my career, this was called customer development, but nowadays it's often called discovery, which we at Herd often shorten to disco. So the reason I've got a Disco Inferno sticker in the middle of my laptop over the Apple logo is because almost every problem I see is the result of a discovery done badly. Most of my job, and probably a lot of your time too, is wasted on the fallout of an idea that went a bit wonky. People often fall deeply in love with an idea and become totally blind to its flaws. And we've got some time together today to explore the problems this can cause. I'll share the main reasons I've seen for digital ideas to fail so you can avoid them. This session is about why digital ideas fail, and I will tell you 3 tales. Number 1, what I learned inside Wandsworth Prison. Number 2, the time I killed a startup. And number 3, cat wigs. Don't worry, that'll all make sense later. But first, a bit about me and what I do. So I'm Scott Colfer. I've been a product person for 20 years and a product leader for the last 10 years. Particularly for those 10 years, I've led non-profit product management in the public sector. I got to co-write the UK government's product manager role description and often led reviews of government services. So that was a fascinating opportunity. I founded the Product Leaders Network, which is the largest one of its kind in the UK. It's got over 100 product leaders from central government, local government, higher education, healthcare, and charities. So I get to learn a lot from people all over the place. And a little bit about Herd. We're an award-winning product analysis, change, and transformation consultancy. We're proud to be trusted by global leading universities, central government departments, FTSE 100 companies, and fast-growing tech businesses. Most clients come to us when they're starting something new, need help getting delivery back on track, want to deliver something new, or looking to grow their in-house capability. Okay, introduction's done. That's enough of that. Here's what I learned in Wandsworth Prison. This is why you signed up for this talk. So back in 2011, I was working for a startup and we needed to win investment to develop our services. Normally, we would go for any grant or bid going, and we'd ask for small investment, and we'd actually win a decent amount. But the thing was, we'd often find that the solution we'd pitch didn't actually work in reality. That idea that sounded great to a funder like a year ago would hit reality, And then we'd find ourselves grinding out some activity to meet funder expectations, but not truly generating value. And we were a social enterprise, so ethics was important. This money was precious, and we wanted it to have an impact, not just like pay our salaries. What we realized was we were often pitching solutions at the time when we had the least knowledge of the problem. Normally, we'd only have a few days, sometimes a few hours, to put together a pitch. And if successful, we'd be stuck with that idea that sounded good on paper to a funder, but that didn't survive first contact with reality. We'd often end up with a solution in search of a problem. Like I said, this was 2011, and this was the same year that something called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries was published. So this book is all about testing the riskiest assumptions about your idea before committing to it, making sure it will generate value in reality. It takes lots of established tools and techniques and smushes them into an overall approach. So my CEO at the time and me pitched and won for investment from a funder called the Esme Fairburn Foundation to adapt the Lean Startup to our social enterprise and to share our learnings with other mission-driven organizations. Now, this is a big book, and we quickly realized that the whole book was too big for us to tackle and implement in one go. But what we could realistically and usefully implement was the notion of discovery. This meant defining problems before committing to solutions. If you're going to fail fast, fail cheap. It means being really clear about the problem you're trying to solve and testing your riskiest assumptions about that problem. So we used this small pot of money to fund internal discovery, paying for the time needed to quickly test our riskiest assumptions about problems we were trying to solve. And this could take anything from a few hours to a few days. And it ranged from simply just digging out research on the web to first-hand research of our own. So on a practical level, we use this funding to provide much better services. We were invited, for example, to pitch for funding to create a website for people who'd recently been released from prison to help them find work through inspiring talking head style videos from people who'd done just that. And we used some of our pot of money to pay my time for about 3 days of discovery. So I used this to spend one day in Wandsworth Prison, sitting in careers sessions and interviewing inmates. Then I spent a day on interviews with people who'd recently left prison. Then spent a day with careers advisors out in the community. And what I learned was that people who've just left prison aren't really spending a lot of time searching for inspiring videos online. They were more likely to be trying to find somewhere to live and enough money to cover bills. They did, however, have a mandatory appointment with job centre advisors. And these advisors struggled to know how to support them to find the best jobs to apply for. What these advisors told me is that employers always asked people to disclose their criminal convictions, even if the employer wasn't really allowed to. There are actually way fewer conditions under which you need to disclose your conviction than you might imagine. And this would often put those people who just left prison off applying for jobs, and it was their first big barrier to finding work. The advisors also told me that at the time, the rules around disclosure of criminal convictions had just changed and nobody really understood them yet. So based on this discovery, we went back with a totally different pitch. We pitched to create a plain language website aimed at job centre staff to help them guide clients through understanding if they needed to disclose their criminal conviction, which mostly they didn't. I also learned job centres had quite creaky computers and they didn't even have sound cards for the most part. So online videos would be a total waste of time. So instead we pitched text-based design that advisors could print off and physically hand to clients. So we offered a better service for way less upfront money and instead added a year's worth of trading support to actually use the website. Incidentally, the service is now considered important enough to be offered by the government on gov.uk. You can actually find it on there now. That was a practical level. On a strategic level, we kept seeing this kind of learning. And as a result, we pitched for fewer opportunities, but asked for more money, with more ambitious scope because we understood the problems better than other organizations. So in the first 6 months, there were about 5 opportunities, and we'd normally pitch for all of them, probably asking for about £50,000 on each of them. But this time, based on internal discovery, we disqualified 3 of the opportunities because we thought, you know what, in all honesty, we do not have a unique understanding of the problem to be solved and would probably create a flawed solution. There are other people out there who could do this better than we could. But 2 opportunities were in our unique area of understanding. We knew we could do the best job. So on those 2, we asked for and won a total of £450,000. Most importantly, we were genuinely able to make an impact through them, and both of them deepened our existing expertise and value proposition. There's some key stuff I learned way back in 2011. Number 1, we often fall in love with solutions whilst they're still really early ideas. Number 2, we often fence ourselves into solutions early on at a time when we know the least about the problems we're trying to solve. We might commit ourselves to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. And number 3, investing some time, even if it's just a few hours, testing our riskiest assumptions about that idea, about that solution, normally helps us realize we're focused on slightly the wrong scope of the problem or slightly the wrong users. In the worst case scenario, we need to kill our idea. But in most cases, we just need to tweak our thinking, and then we can continue way more successfully. Okay, that's the end of the first tale. Here's a palate cleanser, because that's a big lump of information. I hope that made sense. I don't know if there's any comments or questions that it'd be useful to answer at this point. Sinead, I think you kindly offered to take a look. This is my colleague Sinead. Thank you so much, Sinead. Did anything stand out to you, Sinead?
Yeah, so there's nothing in the comments question-wise. There's some people that are here just for the cat weeks, so I'll make sure, yeah,
Nice.
stay around
in
for
that case. I'll make sure we get through to the cat week sooner rather than later, right? Maybe I should just do one on cat wigs next time. Okay. In that case, let's move on to number 2. This takes us one step further to cat wigs, you'll be pleased to hear. If you do have any questions as we're going through the sessions, there'll be another break in a few minutes and we can answer them there. Okay, so let me tell you about the time I helped to kill a startup. If we skip forward from 2011 to 2014, now I'm running my own product consultancy, helping founders to find and improve their business model. What I learned at the time was, again, people fall in love with their solution, but more specifically, founders would often create a great product and then not be interested at all in every other bit of the business. Or they'd create a great product in principle, but it didn't, once again, solve a problem that actually existed. If I think about one founder in particular, they asked me to help them find their business model. So they got investment from a telecoms company. That telecoms company wanted to get into software. So this was around the time that Apple had, hugely successfully launched the App Store. Loads of other big companies wanted to get into software for mobile phones, so there was some money sloshing around. They had given this person, this founder, money to build an app with an algorithm that would help young people without formal education to showcase their informal experience and connect with jobs. And he asked me to review his business model and help him with a roadmap for his investors. So I practiced what I preach, and I tested their idea against reality. I interviewed the founder, I interviewed their team, I interviewed their commercial customers, and I interviewed their users, who are the young people. I did this discovery, and unfortunately, realized that the founder's business model was fundamentally broken. So, quick note, if you've not heard of it before, the thing I've got on screen is called a business model canvas. And what it does is it breaks a business model into its critical elements. So if you look on the left-hand side, all of the bits on the left are costs. So you've got the key activities that your product or business undertakes. You've got key resources. Sadly, that includes people. I don't think we should call people resources, but people go in there. But it's also everything else that you need to be successful. You've got your key partners, because most products, most businesses have a lot of partners, a lot of partnerships, and they take time, so they're a cost. And all of these things add up on the left-hand side to their cost. On the right-hand side, you've got who your customers are. Quite often, people might have more than one type of customer. So there's maybe multiple customer segments. You've got your relationship with them. So how do they know that you exist? How do you communicate with them? How do you make them aware of your products? That kind of thing. You've got channels, and that's more specifically how they make use of your product or service. So if you're software as a service provider, then your channel is probably the web, for example. And all of those things add up to revenue if you're commercial, or just value, whatever you value if you're a non-profit organization. And fundamentally, a business model canvas is through your value proposition, balancing your costs and your value. And obviously, you want your value to be significantly higher than your cost. That's when you've got a really good value proposition. And that's when you've got a solid business model. As a side note, this totally works non-profit as well, although the bottom right-hand corner says revenue streams. If you're like an internal team without clear revenue or anything else, if you just call it value and measure what you value, everything else works. I managed to introduce this to central government. It totally works for public services, for example. And this is a great tool to figure out if you've got a business model. So let's go back to the founder I was working with. They assumed that the recruitment departments in companies wanted to list job vacancies with them, and that young people wanted to find roles, and that developing a website with an algorithm would power this. So their value proposition was a job listings website with a good algorithm and a young user base. But in reality, the founder was the value proposition. So what I mean by that is, when I went digging into this and did the discovery, the founder was great at building trust and relationships. So charities trusted the founder enough to refer on their young volunteers who were doing great things without having formal education. And the corporate social responsibility departments for large companies, not the HR departments, the CSR departments, trusted the founder to connect them with great young hires that allowed them to fulfill some of their CSR commitments. And they were willing to pay for this. The founder was the middle person. The founder was the value proposition. The value proposition was trust and unique relationships. So what the founder needed was money to pay people to get on the phone and need the operational side of these relationships and placements. But all of the investment was tied up in salaries for software engineers working on a website and an algorithm that wasn't needed. And none of the investment could be used for operational staff to actually manage relationships and placements. I broke up with my client and I said I couldn't in all good conscience take their money, because I could not see a way to make their business model work. There was a great business in there, but it wasn't a software one. And all of their money was tied up in software. I just couldn't see where it could go. The client, unsurprisingly, was annoyed at the time with me, because both I was breaking up with them and I was telling them, I don't think your business can work. But we caught up a few months later and they said, look, Scott, I was really expletive off with you at the time. But what I didn't tell you is I'd not taken a salary for months, and I just found out I was going to become a parent. And a few weeks after our last meeting, after a bit of soul searching, I handed my investment back and I closed my company. I've actually just agreed to take a job with a normal company, and I'll be getting a salary again soon. And I've started having a personal life again. And I learned a few things from this. One is a business model canvas is a really powerful tool to figure out if you have a viable business. The other thing I learned is a product on its own is usually not a viable business. But most surprisingly to me, I learned that taking the wrong type of investment can kill an otherwise viable business. Okay, time for another palate cleanser. That was a bit intense. Let's take a break. Sinead, did anything pop up there that you thought looked interesting?
So we've got a comment from Drew in relation to your first story, and he just said that really resonated with some of his experiences, and he thinks one of the hardest challenges can be sometimes persuading some stakeholders that the investment in this discovery is worth it, and where you should spend as much time as feasible when there's some kind of time pressure to actually ship stuff, and just committed, it's classic think slow to move fast type of argument.
100%. It's so difficult, right? I totally agree, Drew. It's so difficult to help people think about finishing successfully over starting quickly. That there's a big emotional attachment to that idea, and yeah, that's a really tricky thing. I wonder if we'll see if we can kind of talk about that a bit later at the end, because we're going to have time for questions. And it sounds like this is the thing that people are most interested in, so I'll crack on. Part 3 is talking about catwigs. So fast forward another year from the last story, and I'm teaching on a product manager course for a learning provider. Catwigs is popular for a learning provider called General Assembly. It's a 10-week evening course, part-time, that's practically based. So all the students bring an idea for a product with them to develop during the course. Effectively, my role was to teach the lean startup that we touched on earlier to people. And in very simple terms, the role of product manager can be described really as helping a product team to bring the lean startup to life for them. The lean startup takes these concepts I've listed on the slide. So lean manufacturing, design thinking, customer development, and agile development, takes them all, smushes them together, and says, here's a way that they can all work together. If you haven't read this, or at least looked into it, it's really worth doing so. I know it's a long time since it was published, but it's still really useful. So the result of teaching this course was I got to see lots of people and their product ideas. And what was so interesting was how consistently people had the same flaws with their ideas. And they'd often realize these flaws around the same time in the course every time. So around 3 to 4 weeks into the course, people would normally realize this fundamental flaw with their business model. And normally it was one of 3 things. One that was quite common was they didn't have a good enough relationship with their users. So they could never even get out and actually test their ideas. Number 2 that was quite common is they were solving the wrong bit of the problem for the wrong people, and they'd realized they had to kind of tweak it a bit. But one that was really common and really fundamental was that nobody really cared enough about their chosen problem and solution. It was just a bit meh. People were like, yeah, that's fine. And that was as much as they got. So coming to this, at the time we talked about catwigs. It was a scale knocking around at this time to understand how urgent is the unmet need you're focusing on. Will it truly motivate people to spend money? Is it catwigs? Is it doors for garages? Or is it antibiotics? So if you think about antibiotics, they're urgent. They sell across the world and they save lives. Pharmaceutical companies are massive. They are some of the biggest and richest organizations in the world. Garage doors are useful if you own a property with a garage and you want to stop your stuff being stolen or being damaged, right? There is a business in there that could be profitable for an owner and employ some staff. Cat wigs are niche, and it's hard to have a strong brand just built around wigs for cats. You might make some money as a sole trader, but it's unlikely you'd make your fortune or even necessarily sustain a modest salary. It could be a fun cottage industry, but it's not necessarily the thing that's going to set the world on fire. We use this scale to help people get a reality check on how urgent and unmet the need was that they were fulfilling. All of these products are fine. You can do all of them. But you want your expectations to be realistic. You wouldn't necessarily rush to quit your job and attract lots of investment if your product was wigs for cats. Fundamentally, what everybody realized and had to kind of work through painfully sometimes was people have to care enough about the unmet need you're fulfilling to pay money. If you don't have an unmet need that's pervasive, urgent, and valuable to solve, then you're not going to get enough people to use your thing. Without that, you've got a hobby, not a business. So I want to try and do some summing up and leave some time for questions and conversation. So why do digital ideas fail? Ideas can be brain crack. There's a YouTuber called ZFrank, and he coined this term back in 2006, and it describes the addictive nature of ideas. Ideas are a safe act of creativity, and just having them can feel like we've achieved something, but we've not really. If you think back to that prison example from the beginning of this, the idea, online videos for people leaving prison, it sounds sensible, but actually it turned out to be terrible. It wouldn't have worked. It was only by taking it out into the real world and showing it to reality that this became apparent. So what I learned is we can't get addicted to our ideas. We have to take them out into the world and test them against reality as soon as possible. Once again, going back to that prison example, this is rhetorical, but how many other organizations do you think actually went and spent time in prison in order to put the idea together and their pitch? The answer is none. We were the only people that did that. It's why we won it, and it's what made our service great. The original idea is a great starting point, but it would have failed. It's going out and testing those ideas against reality that will make your idea succeed. Okay, that's why digital ideas fail, but I'd like to kind of end on a more positive note, if I'm honest, and think about why they succeed. Because I actually love ideas. Ideas are leaps of faith that get things moving. Without ideas, we just wouldn't have any action. So let's nourish and support ideas, and let's treat them as leaps of faith. When we see ideas as the first step of a journey into the unknown, not as the vision of what will definitely happen, that's when they use them. Let's use ideas to get us moving, but hold on to them lightly and change as we learn. I walked into a prison thinking I was getting ideas for motivational films and left knowing I was actually helping people to understand how to disclose criminal convictions. If you treat your big idea actually as the start of a never-ending series of little ideas, each of which you'll test, learn from, and then use to tweak your product, then you're set up for success. If you get out into the world and realize, actually, I'm looking at the wrong bit of the problem for the wrong people, or I've got something that nobody would pay for, this is fantastic information. We want to find that out as soon as possible before we've spent a lot of money or committed to a business model, because that way we can tweak as much as we want in the early stages and make the most of that freedom. Okay, those are my 3 tales of why an idea fails. Thanks so much for your attention. First of all, I referred to a lot of things during this talk. So if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I'll post out a comment later today with all of the links and all of the references. Next, this session is what I call Discovery Foundations. It focuses on what I learned over 5 years from 2010 to 2015 and is effectively about the problem of falling in love with a solution. I'll soon be running an intermediate discovery session covering what I learned over 5 years from 2015 to 2020. During this time, I led use of discovery in a bit of UK government, and it covers what I learned when I did a cross-government review of discovery, and also what I learned when I reviewed about 50 discoveries over that time. This is really about the perils of falling in love with problems. If you sign up to the mailing list, I'll keep you informed of the next date for that session. Now, finally, if you need help with discovery, then get in touch with us at Herd Consulting. Discovery is our core service, and advanced discovery support is reserved for our clients, and it includes the cutting edge approaches we've developed from 2020 up to today. If you've enjoyed this talk, Herd has another talk tomorrow on a different type of continual improvement you should take a look at as well. And just want to say thank you so much for your time. I hope that was of use, and if you have the time, I'd love to do some questions and answers.
We've got a few in the chat. If you want me to start with some of those, Scott?
Yeah, please do.
So we've got one from Andrew, who's interested in the approach that you took to the interviews that you had with founders and customers, etc. And were there any key questions that you asked all stakeholders? And did you direct particular lines of questioning to certain segments?
The honest answer is I cannot remember because it was ages ago. I guess the more useful response is for any of the interviews I've done over the years. So people actually do this properly, like as a job. So they're really good people to listen to. You can also pragmatically do it as well. It doesn't stop anybody else from just being able to ask some questions. And I think the general approach I've taken, based on what I've learned from those folks, is be really clear on the riskiest assumptions you want to test and try and get to asking about a real experience that person has had rather than a theoretical question. So if I ask like one of them, what do you want? I could get all sorts of answers. But if I say, tell me about the last time that you did XYZ, I'm getting their real experience. So I think generally that's the approach. It's what's the riskiest assumption I'm looking to test and what is the closest I can get to giving that person space to relive that experience or even actually watch them going through it in order to get the best insights possible. But it's kind of skewed towards a hypothesis, effectively. What's my hypothesis? And then how do I ideally try and observe that person having a real experience in order to test that hypothesis?
Thank you. And Lauren's asked if there's any methods that you've used to encourage a team to not fall in love with the first solution.
Yeah, I mean, the most formal approach was, so I was head of product at the Ministry of Justice for quite a number of times, and we formalized discovery there. So that was the most structured way, was there had to be a review in order to move out of discovery into doing something more with it. It's online, in fact, we published the approach, so it's one of the things I can share. But we actually said, effectively, tell us how desirable, viable, and feasible is it? So there's somebody called Teresa Torres who talks about that a lot. So desirable, do people want it? Not just your users, though. Do the people in the organization want it? Unless you're a single product and you're the founder or something, you're often having to negotiate with others whether something goes ahead. So it wasn't just, do you see that it's valuable? Do your users see it's valuable? It's, do these two directors get on enough that you could partner with each other? That kind of thing. Viable, like, are we the best people to do it? Sometimes people will spot an idea, but they didn't actually have the influence or authority to do it. Whether that was a startup where they just didn't have the roots into the space, or whether it was a team in a large organization and they'd found something that just wasn't their remit. There was that. Then the third question is, like, just can we do it? Like, fundamentally, do we have the skills to do it? And so using those and kind of taking them outside of the team and saying this is a way of checking in, it's like a kill or continue meeting, is probably the most structured way. The messier answer is, yeah, it just depends on like the person and how emotionally they are invested in. And sometimes there's a huge amount of work like behind the scenes to try and negotiate with that person, like a joint decision about should we go ahead with this. Interestingly, some of the discovery reviews that we did in this large organization, behind the scenes, the team would say, look, we all think this should stop, but person X is really invested in it. And you help us. And we actually use that review point for sometimes the majority of a team to help them all kind of have a neutral space to talk with their colleague and be like, actually, it's not just that this looks good on its own terms, but there's 10 other things that could happen. We've only got 3 slots for things to happen. It's not, is this good or bad? It's, is this one of the top 3 we can go ahead with this month? So quite often it was about not making it a good or a bad idea, but just, is this the best one we can go ahead with right now? Sinead, sorry to keep pinging you. Anything else that stood out to you?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Kim's got quite a few, so I don't know if you want to pick up a separate conversation with Kim Rowan, but one of her questions is, do you have a template that helps structure thinking from product to solution on paper?
The best one that I've got that's already online is on the Ministry of Justice website. We published back in the day why we were doing it there. So that was the kind of template we used, and it was basically, we didn't go too heavy on a template in terms of here's how you fill it in, but really heavy on the, you may even remember it, like the questions, like, is it urgent? Is the problem urgent? Is it pervasive? Is it feasible to solve? Is it actually valuable? Have you measured it? That kind of thing. So I can include that in the links from this. But we really went hard on questions for people to answer.
Yes.
Rather than like fill in these boxes.
To structure your thinking out. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But and we always said, like, if you, a great discovery review would be 5 minutes long. You'd say who you're going to help, how you're going to help them, what's the baseline, what's the target for improvement, and explain why you're confident in that. And you know, we always said we'd be super happy with a 5-minute thing. The more you can tell us who you're going to help, how you're going to help them, what the starting point is, and what the improvement is you're looking for, the more we would be like, that sounds amazing, please take our money.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Kim and Alec.
So you've partly answered Tim's question around you know, killing bad ideas, and how can you help people with that, similar to Lauren's question. But are there any tips and tricks to lower the stakes for experimenting during discovery?
Yeah, I think with experiments, it's the least work needed to test. And quite often in discovery, one of the things people are looking for is like buy-in and things like that. They'll often say, I've got buy-in for X, Y, Z. And I would say, well, what is it? How do you measure it? That sounds quite intangible. But there's like really interesting things we could do. So another space where I was pitching for something, and these people said, how can you show me you have buy-in? I think we used a memorandum of understanding as an experiment, for example. So if we're saying these people have bought into our idea and they will partner with us, our experiment was, okay, what's the easiest way we can properly test that buy-in? And I think something like a memorandum of understanding was the most efficient experiment, because that compelled them to do something, really, but all the effort just needed to go into that partnership negotiation. We didn't need to like build a thing. We didn't need to like release a thing or publish a thing. That was the experiment. So I think with experiments, quite often it's being a bit creative and thinking genuinely, what's the riskiest assumption, and then what is the least work needed to confidently test that assumption. And that's really the true origin of what a minimum viable product is. If you read that label, some people may or may not have heard of the term minimum viable product. The real definition of it in the lean startup is really what's the least work needed to test your riskiest assumption. That's what an MVP actually is. It's not the first version of your product that you launch. That's your launch product. MVP is what's a hypothesis for increasing the value of your product that you can test. And so, yeah, for experiments, it's quite often being honest about your riskiest assumption, but also thinking about the confidence you need and doing the least possible to be kind of lazy in a good way. We've probably got time for one more question before doing some wrapping up. Sinead, is there any that stood out that you found particularly interesting that you'd like to hear a response to?
Yep, so a quick look, there's a few in there. So Gottfried has asked, what is your personal take or experience on design thinking?
So design thinking, it's, thank you for the question. One of the things I referred to is an influence to the lean startup. And at the time it came out, it made sense for two reasons. One is it was quite often used initially by quite small approaches. It got used by bigger ones very quickly, but it started off in small things. The reason I say that is if you're a small organization, you can be purely focused on like a single product or service and just focused on improving experiences for your customers or users. And it works well there. It also was introduced at a time where like the web was quite new. So almost any idea you hadn't been done yet if it was on the web. And so you could literally just think, I've got this idea. I want to use something like design thinking as a method for me testing whether an idea actually lands with people. But now, many, many years later, it's still useful. And I think it needs other context, though. So number one is most ideas for the web have now actually been done. So it doesn't really work as well in helping you to figure out how your thing fits in a way more complicated landscape. And another thing is, if you're in a large organization, you maybe have multiple products and services, and you once again need to kind of map out the landscape of other things and make sure you complement rather than compete. So I think design thinking remains really useful as a tool for conveying the concepts that we're talking about. And I think if you are in a small organization in a truly innovative space, then in and of itself, it can really allow you to get moving. However, I think for lots of us nowadays, we'd need lots of other things around it to make it truly useful and to help us position ourselves in 2024 in relation to way more stuff going on than there maybe was back in the kind of 2000s and 2010s. Better bring it to a close there. First of all, thank you so much. You ended up doing a lot of work there, so I really appreciate that. Also, thank you so much to everybody for coming. As I said, time is precious. I really appreciate it. Final shout outs. If you want to connect, please do. I'll pop my profile link here. I'll put links there to everything else, including the other places you can keep in touch. As I said, my colleague Christina is doing a session as well. I hope you have a lovely day and I hope to connect with lots of you soon.